recent years, he's become a formidable figure in the world of climate change science, touring the world, sometimes in colourful style, making the challenge against the ideologically and scientifically flawed case of anthropological global warming. But, unfazed by the resulting controversy that accompanies him, he continues to bamboozle the opposition, not only by his immense academic command of the subject, but by the sheer weight of common sense thrown in for good measure. In 2009, he joined the UK Independence Party, becoming, under its then leader, Lord Pearson of Rannoch, its deputy leader and principal spokesman on energy and climate change. As the author of its well-accredited energy policy, he remains today the most popular speaker and champion of the climate realism and anti-wind farm cause. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a warm welcome to Lord Monckton, Lord Christopher Monckton. Thank you very much.
My lords, that's me. Ladies and gentlemen, after that magnificent introduction from our chairman, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Now, my topic is going to be what we can do to use the Navitus Bay wind farm proposal as a method of getting all wind farms throughout the United Kingdom stopped forever. That's the ambition. Yes. And I'm going to start very briefly by galloping through the main points of why global warming isn't much of a problem, so that there's no need for these things anyway. But the main focus of what I'm going to say will be on the economics of these wind farms as they relate to the possibility of making global warming go away, even if it were going to happen at the rate predicted and at the cost predicted. Now, I'm going to start by saying, as one must, that there are many real environmental problems in the world. For instance, deforestation is one, and this is another. There has been global warming for the last 300 years, as you can see, and we could not have influenced any except the right-hand little skimpy number on the end there. The rest of it is natural. Now, deforestation, as I've said, is a real environmental problem, as you can see. But what I'm going to do is to look at this extraordinary scare. It's probably the biggest fraud ever perpetrated by humanity. It's an extraordinary thing how our governing class worldwide has ganged up against us to peddle this nonsense to us and to exaggerate a small grain of truth into an enormous supposed problem that doesn't really exist. But this is a scare which, despite having had tens of billions, now hundreds of billions, spent on it, has died, to the astonishment of the governing class. It can't believe this has gone away so quickly, and here is why. The scare began really in 1988, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was founded. And here you see a graph which was presented originally by James Hansen of NASA to the US Congress on a day when it was particularly hot. It was in fact the hottest June day they've had since then. And the air conditioning had been turned off by Senator Tim Wirth and Senator Al Gore so as to make the room especially hot. And these exaggerated predictions, the blue and the black ones there, were made to Congress, and they were told it's going to get even hotter than it is today in here. And he also put a third case on, labelled C, in a dotted line in green there, which was what would have happened, he thought, if we didn't emit any more CO2 after the year 2000. Well, we've gone on emitting CO2, and if anything, a slightly accelerated rate since 2000, but the red line is what's actually happened. And as you can see, the red line is now a long way away from Hansen's predictions. In other words, the global temperature is not responding as ordered. In fact, the trend is so different. You can see the trend lines there through the blue and black between them, and the red one being the real trend. And you see it's less than half of what Hansen predicted to Congress. Now, in fact, over the last 17 full years, according to the RSS satellite outfit, they take measurements every month and compile a list. For exactly 17 years, that's 204 months, or 203 degrees of freedom, if you are talking in statistical terms, then there has been no global warming at all. It is a zero least squares linear regression trend. Absolutely no global warming whatsoever. Now, hands up, any of you who have seen that interesting fact reported in any mainstream news medium.
No.
Not a hand goes up. Let that be put on the record. They are banging on daily about global warming this and global warming that. It is surely relevant, there hasn't been any now for 17 full years. And in fact, there has been none on this record distinguishable from the measurement, coverage and bias uncertainties for almost 25 years. For a quarter of a century, we don't actually really know whether there's been any global warming at all. For 17 years, there has been, on any view, none whatsoever. And you can see the CO2 concentration, that faint grey line going up there, that has been rising throughout at a rate of 2 parts per million every year. And yet, no global warming has resulted. In fact, there is now a diverging trend between the most recent predictions in the IPCC's fifth assessment report, made just a couple of months ago. I'm an expert reviewer for that document, and that was their prediction. I told them not to predict this. And here is what has happened since 2005, from which they made their predictions. You'd think that if they publish a report in 2013, they could at least have accurately represented what has happened since 2005. They even got that wrong. And there is the discrepancy. And you'll see that because the two lines diverge, the red one is the forecast, and the blue one is what's actually happened in the real world, the gap between prediction and reality is growing every month, relentlessly. And in fact, it's even worse with the ocean heat content, which is vital to all this because the oceans are huge, and that's where a lot of the heat that we generate by adding CO2 to the atmosphere is likely to go. And the ocean heat content is rising 4.5 times slower than was predicted by the computer models. At sea level, everybody goes banging on about sea level, and it has been rising. It has been rising according to the entire record of, for 8 years, of the Envisat satellite, which failed earlier last year. Sea level was rising during the entire period of record of that satellite at a rate equivalent to 1.3 inches per century. And that is a trouble for us aristocrats because it means we're going to spoil our spat. Rainfall. You hear, oh, there's going to be more rainfall or less rainfall. Well, here is the trend in rainfall. Over the last 247 years, it's the longest continuous rainfall record in the world, in England and Wales. And as you will see, it's barely changed throughout that time. And there is no pattern whatsoever of changing rainfall discernible in that graph at all. Until I calculated the trend on that, nobody had ever done that. And then there's no need for a cow fart tax because this is methane in black here, hardly rising at all. And look at the exaggerated predictions. And I even saw an absurd photograph the other day of some scientists who had fitted canisters onto the backs of cows with kind of enormous funnels to catch the methane every time the cow either eructated from the front or farted from the back. I mean, this is how stupid this now is. Anything to do with climate change, they'll throw money at a scientist. So they're all at it, but here is the truth. The 4 previous IPCC reports all predicted a huge increase. It hasn't happened. Then hurricanes. You hear all about that, and Hurricane Haiyan, and they say Hurricane Haiyan was caused by global warming. Sir, why was Hurricane Haiyan not caused by global warming? You ought to pay more attention in class. The reason why Hurricane Haiyan wasn't caused by global warming is anyone. There hasn't been any global warming for 17 years. Do you see how easy this is? Take a demerit point and we'll keep you in after school. And here is the official record of hurricanes going back for the whole of the satellite here and a bit before, actually. And what you see is that at the moment, the right-hand end there, that little green cartouche, that's where it is now, and it's just about at the bottom end of where it's been. So there is no trend, or no significant trend. in hurricanes. A slight uptrend in major hurricanes recently, but not much. Otherwise, it's just generally drifting along quite quietly. And in fact, in the United States, they've now had no major landfalling hurricane for 8 years. That's the longest since records began. And you hear a lot about the ice melting. All the bedwetters, they love this ice melting. Well, the fact is, the only danger to sea level is from all those bedwetters, because the ice is not really melting very fast, is it? This is the sea ice extent. You can see the extent up here, which sort of wobbles around annually, and you have the trend here in red, and the sea ice extent and trend. If you had a heartbeat as healthy as that, you would be regarded as a very healthy little planet. And here, Greenland is actually getting colder. Most of you are too young to remember, but 8,000 years ago, it was 2.5 Celsius warmer than it is today. And it's got colder. And so how can you melt ice which is at an average temperature of -30 to -50 Celsius when it's actually getting colder and not getting warmer anyway? You can't do it. So all that talk about, oh, Greenland's going to melt away. No, it's not. The last time Greenland melted away was 850,000 years ago, because there were forests on Greenland then. So even if it melts away, we still can't tell it's us. It has happened before, though quite a long time ago. The real problem, if there were to be a lack of snow or ice, is if there were a lack of northern hemisphere snow cover, because the land mass of the northern hemisphere is about 20% of the surface of the planet, and most of that gets covered in snow every winter. Most of it's covered in snow at the moment. We've been lucky here. Even Jerusalem and Cairo this week have had snow, and that's a very rare event. And they're certainly not talking about global warming down there at the moment. Nor are they in the United States, where they've been under feet of snow for quite some time, and thousands of cold weather records have been broken. But here is the trend in northern hemisphere snow cover, and it is an uptrend very slightly. Basically no real change. And so yet again, the idea that the snow is going to recede, and you remember that fatuous article in The Independent about 10 or 15 years ago, never again will our children see snow. Well, yes, they will. It's all carrying on just as it always has. Floods on the Brisbane River in Australia. There were 8 major floods before 1900, between 1840 and 1900. The big ones were 1840 and 1893. There's been nothing like that since, and only 3 major floods since 1840. So none of this is happening as they said. And then this was a really spectacular one, 50 million climate refugees, 50 million of them, by 2010. Where are they, ladies and gentlemen? I'll tell you what, they've all been drowned by rising sea level. Not. So now, where did they go wrong? We're going to do this very quickly. We've seen that they did go wrong. You see every prediction they made, or every major prediction, we've now dealt with those, they were all wrong. Here's why they got it wrong. They undervalued, first of all, the influence of the sun. Here is a record, one of the most reliable in the world and the longest in the world that we have. It's the amount of sunshine actually reaching the Earth's surface. We never bother to do this in Britain, but partly because we don't see it very often, but in Japan, they did do this for 100 years using things called pyrometers. And what it showed was that you get in red the changes in solar activity, and slightly to the right of them, usually, you get the changes in temperature, in blue. In red is the solar change, in blue is the change in temperature, and you can see there's a very good fit between the two. And we know that changes in temperature down here can't cause changes in solar activity, so we know that it's the other way around, and the solar activity is what's really causing the changes in temperature. And indeed, if we look at a similar picture from the Arctic, which is where you get the biggest temperature changes, whatever direction, then you see that the temperature and the solar activity, provided you scale them right, again, they match very nicely. But you don't get a good match with CO2, which just drifts up like that, and the temperatures are just jiggling up and down completely unconnected with it, just as we saw with that 17-year temperature record. And then this is one of the big mistakes they made. They say, well, CO2 causes all this forcing, which is a way of causing warming. But then they say there's a negative one on the other side of the account, of the white area on the other side there, which is from us putting up soot into the atmosphere. And each particle of soot acts like a little umbrella shading us from the sun. And they're saying that the reason why we haven't had warming recently is that all of this soot in places like China, India, Indonesia, and Africa is shading us from the sun, and therefore we're not getting any global warming. If that were true, then all we'd have to do is take off all the soot filters off the chimneys of our power stations, global warming sorted, let's move on. In fact, one of the reasons why, in fact the main reason why there was a lot of global warming between 1976 and 2001 was a naturally occurring reduction in cloud cover, which is quite variable globally, between 1983 and 2001, studied by a paper called Pinker et al. 2005, from which this is the first graph. And what it shows is that the trend was of 2.9 watts per square metre of forcing. That won't mean much to you. All I'll do is to say to you that in those 18 years and 1 month, there was more radiative forcing, more propensity to cause warming from this naturally occurring reduction in cloud cover than there was in all the man-made activities since 1750. And that's why we got global warming, which stopped late in 2001, because at that time the cloud cover came back much as normal worldwide, as the International Satellite Cloud Climatology Project testifies. They also got the paleoclimate wrong. How did the temperature go before? Now, in 1990, they got it right. They said there was a medieval warm period, warmer than today, a little ice age, colder than today, and today's temperature, little pimple on the right, not particularly significant or worrying. And that, of course, didn't allow them to whip up the scare. Now, what I did was to see whether this graph was right from the IPCC's 1990 report by putting it opposite a reconstructed graph of sea level rise, because as the world gets warmer, the sea level rises, only, as you'll see, a variation of 8 inches either side of the long run median throughout the last 1,000 years. So the idea we're going to get lots of sea level rise is basically nonsense. There's no warrant for it in the actual measured evidence. So you see here that it does match very nicely. The two curves are, you practically lay them on top of the other, and they'd more or less be the same. And that's what you would expect. But in 2001, they decided they had to abolish the medieval warm period. In fact, one of their scientists at the IPCC wrote to another and said, we have to abolish the medieval warm period. So they did, with this graph here. It's known as the hockey stick graph. Bye-bye. Just like that, as Tommy Cooper used to say, no more warm period, no more little ice age, but a big increase in temperature in the 20th century, exaggerated by 50% because it was Northern Hemisphere only, and that was said to be all our fault, and nothing like it had happened before. And this was adopted by the UN's Climate Panel as its logo for many years, until 2 Canadian scientists came along and showed that this graph was bogus. And as we've seen, my own method of showing it's bogus is it's probably the clearest you can get. There clearly was a medieval warm period, or that rise in sea level couldn't have happened. So now we go on to the central reason in the mathematics of the climate models, why this went wrong. Now don't worry, you won't be tested on this later, you will. But the point is that what we have here is the equation showing that as you increase the temperature feedbacks, where you warm up the climate a bit and then it warms up some more because the snow and ice melt a bit and you get more sunshine getting in, or you get more water vapor in the atmosphere and less of the radiation can get out. These are called feedbacks. They do exist. The question is how much of an influence they have. The UN's Climate Panel says they have a huge influence, right up in this range here, just at the point where you're beginning to get a really serious potential rise in temperature. And so you get this graph like this, and you see this in a lot of the climate textbooks. And they say how worrying this all is. Well, it would be if this was at all physically possible, but I'm going to show you that it isn't. But what they never show you in the textbooks, I calculated this, is what happens when you push the loop gain above unity, going in that direction, above 1. Then what was being caused warming here, trying to drive the temperature up to infinity, suddenly tries to drive it down to infinity. Of course, it won't get there. But that's what they say will happen. Now, there is no physical process in the real climate by which that singularity can possibly exist. There is no mechanism by which feedbacks that have been causing warming at one moment can suddenly cause cooling the next. They're using the wrong equation. There is the equation. It's the wrong equation. That equation generates this graph, and it's simply the wrong equation. They need in that equation a damping term, which they haven't got. And that damping term would, if you put any credible value on that damping term, it would divide the amount of warming they say you would get by at least 4, ending the climate problem. So, reality is beginning to break through. Here, for instance, is a statement quite recently made. The size of future temperature increases still subject to uncertainty. The detection of forced climate change and observations not always straightforward. Hitherto unknown aspects of the climate and climate change could emerge. It's not possible to determine exactly how much the Earth will warm. And you'll notice who said all this? The Royal Society. Previously the cheerleader for all this rubbish. They are now saying the science is not settled. Or if it is, it's settled in a direction opposite from what they had originally thought. So huge changes in the scientific community itself. They are beginning to admit, one by one, that they screwed this up. But in any case, let's pretend that most of what they say is correct. We're now going to apply all this to whether it's worth doing anything about wind farms. And we've already heard, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, about the birds that get killed. You remember that case in Scotland a couple of months ago, where a rare bird that hadn't been seen since 1972 appeared off our shores. Every twitcher in Britain was, going after it in their ghastly camper vans and taking films of it. And then they saw it fly into a wind farm, which batted it out of the sky and killed it. And the Royal Society for the Prevention of Birds, when asked what they thought about this, said, we have to deal with global warming. It's the most serious problem on the planet, and if that means killing every bird on the planet, that's the only way we can save every bird on the sorry, we'll get back to you on that one. I mean, it's like the Greenpeace people who say, the polar bears can't find the ice to get themselves back to the land to get some food, and so they're all going to have to eat the penguins. Just one problem with that. Yeah, polar bears at the North Pole, penguins at the South Pole. That's green science for you. So anyway, here is the birds that were killed in Navarre, and just one wind farm. Here is another example, different kind of birds being killed, thousands of them. In the end, one campaigner, by taking pictures like this and sending them all around the internet, shamed the Spanish government into shutting down Spain's largest wind farm just a couple of years ago. So the retreat of governments in the face of the evidence is beginning. Well, now, I'm going to take the example, first of all, of a real live wind array that's already being built. And we know what the subsidy is, we know all the sums. And this is where I'm going to show you just how absurd economically it is to try to do anything about global warming by wind farms. Now, this banknote, incidentally, is from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. It's $100 trillion. It might buy you a loaf of bread if you were lucky. That's what happens if you follow stupid climate policies or stupid policies of any kind. It just gets too expensive in the end. So, how much would it cost the world if we sat back and allow the 1 Celsius of warming we might now see this century? Nobody's any longer talking about 3 Celsius of warming this century, except the IPCC, of course. But assuming that it's going to come down to about 1 Celsius of warming, it's going to cost 1% of GDP. Roughly speaking, it's 1% of GDP per Celsius degree, up to about 3 Celsius. And that's a figure which is based on the Stern Report's analysis, page 9 of the executive summary, if you want to know where that figure comes from. Now, we're now going to look at how much of the global CO2 emissions that one wind farm of 300 megawatts rated capacity would get. The first thing you notice is that only 24% of that capacity is deliverable. That figure is probably an exaggeration because you have to allow also for the recently discovered degradation in the performance and output of wind farms over time, particularly the offshore ones. So in fact, that only gives you 72 megawatts out of the 300. As a fraction of the 43.2 gigawatts of UK electricity demand, that's 1/600th. That's an easy enough sum to do. Now, electricity is 1/3 of UK emissions, CO2 emissions, and those in turn are 1.5% of global emissions. So that means that we're going to reduce 1/200th there from electricity. Multiply those two together, and the percentage of global CO2 emissions that the Thanet wind farm would abate by 2023 is 1/600th of 1/200th, which is 0.00083%. You begin to see where this is going. Now, the CO2 concentration in 2010, before we had the Thanet wind array, before it was even started, 391 microatmospheres. It's predicted by the IPCC that that would have risen by 2030 to 444 microatmospheres. IPCC 2007, table 10.26. You can look all this up and check that I'm not bullshitting you here. It's the other side that does that. We give you the data. Now, CO2 concentration by 2030 with THANET at the end of the 20-year lifetime of the THANET thing would fall as a result of THANET from 444 to 443.9996. And all of this is mainstream climate science. There's not a word of this that any expert from the IPCC would be able to disagree with. So, we now have to work out how much CO2 forcing, that's the propensity to cause warming, would be abated by the THANET wind array. And the answer is, it's very impressive, it's 0.000005 watts per square metre. Not a lot. And with that figure, multiplied by a standard 20-year climate sensitivity parameter, and I won't bore you what goes into that parameter, it's long and complicated, but that's a reasonably respectable value for it, the amount of global warming that will be made to go away by the operation of this wind farm in THANET will be 0.00002 Celsius. And that's all. That is so small that it's something like 1/50,000th of the smallest amount of temperature change that we are capable of measuring with modern instruments and methods worldwide as a global temperature change, which is about a 20th of a Celsius degree. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So even if this THANET wind farm were to work as advertised, we would not have any means of knowing that it had, because we couldn't measure it. That's how silly this is. Now, here's how much it's going to cost. And it's traditionally done in dollars, this, so I'm doing this in dollars. You can divide by the appropriate fraction to convert to pounds. About 1.2 billion sterling, but $2 billion. Then you take that global warming abated and you divide the one by the other, and that gives you the unit cost. If we had these offshore wind farms were the primary way of getting global warming to go away worldwide, and that's what we used, measures of equivalent cost ineffectiveness, then it would cost you just over $1 quadrillion, and that is a 1 with 15 noughts on the end, to make 1 Celsius of global warming go away. $1 quadrillion, which is quite a bit. So if you then look at just the projected global warming of just under half a Celsius degree, K is Kelvin because we do it in Kelvin as well, it's the same thing as Celsius when you're looking at temperature change, multiply those two together and you get the cost of abating the global warming that is due to happen worldwide during the lifetime of the THANET wind array if we were using methods like the THANET wind array worldwide. And the answer is a bargain basement, $500 trillion. And that in turn, as a percentage of real global GDP, and I've taken 60 trillion in 2010 as the GDP, I've uplifted it by 3% a year and added them together, $1,744 trillion of GDP over that 20-year period, and 522 trillion. So the global abatement cost as a percentage of the 20-year global GDP, 30%. Very nearly a third of everything we make and sell worldwide for 20 years would have to be spent just on making global warming of 1 Celsius degree or half a Celsius degree go away in that 20-year period. That's how silly this is. Now the global abatement cost, therefore, 30% of GDP, we compare that now with the cost of adapting to 1 Celsius of warming, assuming there was any cost, there isn't actually, but we'll pretend that there is. And it's 30 times, and I'm not saying 30%, I'm saying 30 times, or 2,900% greater cost to make global warming go away by methods like the THANET wind array than it would be to sit back and do nothing. Now, with that background, we can look at the Navitus Bay scheme. Now we've done it on a real one that's already existing, we can go back and look at Navitus Bay. So here goes. Here you've got 1.1 gigawatts of rated capacity, 24% of that, 264 megawatts. By then, I think that the gigawattage would have gone up from 43.2 to 46.5, an uplift of 3% a year over the 5 years between the two schemes. So that means 1/176th of the fraction there. You multiply that by the 1/200th we had before, and you're going to get again 0.003% of the global CO2 emissions will be abated by Navitus Bay. Now, CO2 concentration, supposing this started operating in 2016, it won't be, but it's near enough, right? 398 microatmospheres, that would go up in 20 years to 460. So that would come down, thanks to Navitus Bay, to 459.998. That in turn means that we would be forestalling 0.00002 Celsius of global warming. You see how feeble this is for this massive expenditure. And so, sorry, that was the forcing. Now here's the warming. It's 0.000007. It's minuscule. And now, the cost of the total subsidy to Navitus, what's that going to be? Well, for a start, we're no longer comparing it with a 2 billion cost for Thanet. We'd have to call it 3 billion, because they're about to uplift by a further 100% of total cost the subsidy they're going to give to offshore wind farms. They're taking some of the money from onshore ones to increase it. We call that 3 billion. We increase it by the output increase from 0.3 to 1.1 gigawatts. We also allow for a little bit of inflation in construction costs over the time, and the subsidy is going to be, if you want my guess, something like $12.5 billion, or around 7 billion quid, to one wind farm. Now, the global warming abated by that, as we've seen, is 0.000007 Celsius. Remember, all of this, mainstream climate science, none of this is different from what they are predicting. And so the unit cost then to abate 1 Celsius of global warming by methods such as this, 1,809 trillion. That's nearly $2 quadrillion for 1 Celsius of warming to go away. And that means that if you do that against the projected global warming over that period, again, just under half a Kelvin, using the IPCC's latest projections, I showed you that red line earlier, that's the slope of it, then the cost of abating 20 years warming, 845 trillion to stop that half a Celsius of warming happening over that period. And the real global GDP will of course have gone up because we're 5 years later. I call that about 2 quadrillion there. And so the global abatement cost of stopping all global warming during the lifetime of the Navitus Bay scheme would be 42% of global GDP, getting on for half of everything that we make and sell worldwide would have to be devoted to building offshore wind farms to make global warming go away completely. That's how silly this is. Global abatement cost, as we see there, compared with 1% of GDP, cost of sitting back, doing nothing and enjoying the sunshine. That's all it is, 1% of GDP. If we did nothing at all, that's our cost. That's their figure. Compare that with 42% of GDP if we do something about it using offshore wind farms, so it's 42 times, or 4,199% greater to act today than to adapt the day after tomorrow. So now I want to end by saying, how do we fight this? Now these figures, I think, will come even to you who are already against wind farms as something of a surprise because of the sheer extravagant difference between the cost of these things and any reasonably foreseeable benefit that they might produce. It's a much larger gap than I guess any of you thought it was. I was surprised when I first did these numbers a couple of years ago. But the methodology you've seen here has been reviewed and published in the scientific literature by the World Federation of Scientists just this year, a couple of months ago. I did a presentation to the World Federation at its session on climate economics at Jurassic in Sicily the year before that, and I had to face an hour and a half of questions when I showed them this run-through. They were horrified. They couldn't believe it. There was a communist sitting in front. He's the deputy head of the thing. He's an old friend of mine. He's a terrible old Marxist. He was furious because, as you know, the left have adopted this as a kind of article of faith. And I had said, I'm accepting all the climate science. I'm using their own equations to work all this out. I'm not changing those equations. I'm using it the way they would use them, with the same values they would use. There's nothing in there that you can argue with because that's the thing you're arguing for. All I'm showing you is what it means. And he said, well, you should have used a zero discount rate. So I said, okay, I'll be Mr. Nice Guy. And the next day I went back in front of them and said, here it is with a zero discount rate. What you've seen here is with a zero discount rate. I should use a 5% discount rate. It makes the numbers far worse for the wind farm. But I've been nice to them. Mr. Nice Guy, that's me, as you all know. So how then in the end, he said, I want it down, I want all the calculations on one page, which is why you've just seen effectively, spelt out bit by bit, really clearly how this is done. He wanted to see that for himself, and he sat me down, he went through it line by line. And at the end, he knew he couldn't find an error, so he said, well, I'm not a climate scientist. Nor am I said, but an awful lot of climate scientists have read this for me, as have a lot of economists, including President Klaus of the Czech Republic, who actually came to the lecture and was fascinated. And so how are we going to fight this nonsense? The first thing is, you've already started, and that's good. You do need to move as fast as possible, because these deadlines are very tight. So you need to set up a fighting fund. You're going to need some money. I can show you how you can do it with a bit less than you would normally think, but you will need some money. Try and find some big bucks backers locally. There are bound to be some heavy hitters who don't like the smell of any of this. And they will pay if they see that you've got a reasonably coherent plan for making this go away. Now, everything you heard from our first speaker today is exactly what you do to cover off all the, what I will call the local aspects of this, which is why I had agreed with him that I wouldn't say anything about those, because he's the expert on your local scheme and I'm not. But what I can bring in is a few pointers of how you can do this. You want to organise a public meeting a little bit down the road, probably early in the new year, to which you invite the press. And, I'll come down for that and I can give them a briefing on some of this. And you want to make sure that you start making freedom of information requests to find out about, in particular, the Aarhus Convention, which requires the UK government to conduct a thoroughgoing environmental assessment and publish it before it allows any such schemes to proceed. As far as I know, they still haven't done that. Until they have, it is actually illegal for them to grant permission for any wind farm. That point has been tested in the Scottish courts, and it was upheld. Though in the end, the wind farm concern, I think, didn't proceed anyway. But the court said, yep, it's clear that this hasn't been complied with. So you have a result from the Scottish courts on that. That's a very useful one to follow up. Now, the other thing I think you can follow up is, why are they paying all these subsidies to windmills, given that on the maths I've just demonstrated, these are completely useless for what was said to be their primary purpose of making global warming go away. And you want to lock them in those letters, I'll help you to write them, to saying that the primary purpose they have in doing this is to make global warming go away. The moment you've said that, then it becomes judicially reviewable in the High Court in London, or the Supreme Court as it calls itself this week, and it's calling itself the Intergalactic Court no doubt next week. But anyway, the Intergalactic Court, we go there and we present a case on judicial review. Once you've gone through all the other stages of appeal and so forth, this is a long way down the road. But you start preparing for this now, because this actually would be a very good case to put to appeal, because it's not some remote country district where there's a few farmers that will be affected. This is going to affect everybody living in and around Bournemouth, and everyone in Swanage, and everyone on the Needles on the Isle of Wight. It's going to have a huge impact. It's unusual in that respect. It's going to be very high profile. So it's an ideal test case. Now you see, all the local factors would not apply to wind farms elsewhere, but the two international ones I've mentioned, one is the Aarhus Convention, the other is the economics I've shown you. On both of those points, it is illegal for the government to proceed with giving consent to this wind farm. It is as simple as that. It is against the law. It's against the law because a treaty obligation comes higher than any UK or even EU law. They have to obey, and they haven't, and the court would so find. And that would be the end of that, unless and until the UK did its environmental and economic assessment. Why haven't they done it? Because they know the figures I've shown you are true. And they don't want to have to admit that they dived into subsidising all this before doing the sums that I eventually did for them and took and stuck under their noses. They know none of this works. They dare not have that assessment. That's why they haven't done it. Otherwise it'd be a mere formality. They dare not do that because it requires public consultation, and the likes of me would say, look, the numbers don't work, and they'd have to concede that they don't. So they're stuck not being able to comply with the Aarhus Convention, because the moment they tried, everyone would see what nonsense this is. And they're stuck on the economics because they know the economics don't work. But they dare not say so, because they've gone so far into this before they did the science. And that was the huge mistake they made. So on those two grounds, the Aarhus Convention, the international treaty obligation that we have, and the fact that even though ministers are given very wide discretion to spend taxpayers' money, they are not allowed ever to spend it in a manner in which no reasonable Secretary of State could possibly be imagined to spend it, even in the exercise of that wide discretion. It's on those two fundamental points that this wind farm, in particular, is a good example of why all wind farms are illegal. And so my advice is we prepare the ground very carefully from here, so that we build up the case to the point where when we challenge them on this and they simply grind through and let it happen anyway, because that's what will happen, that's what they'll do, then we go to the High Court, and I have a cost-free way of doing that, so don't worry about the cost. And we then put the case to the High Court, and I think we have a sporting chance of winning it. I've done quite a few judicial review cases, though I'm not a lawyer, and I know the game a bit, and I think we do have a chance on these two arguments. So the one final point, and then we'll take questions. The climate behaves as a chaotic object, mathematically, rather like the cricket. I was down in Australia earlier this year, and I explained this chaos to them. I said, you get unexpected results in a chaotic object like the cricket scores, because they behave chaotically too, mathematically speaking. I'm about to do a learned paper on it. And I said, here, of course, you've got some England supporters from the Barmy Army, and I said to them, after all, who would have believed that not only could England win back the Ashes after about a century not having them, but hold on to them as well, just rubbing it in, I said. They were very angry with me. But the climate also behaves as a chaotic object. Now what I'm going to do is to show you what that means by taking a really simple chaotic function, which simply says that f of z maps to z squared plus c, a complex number. You understand this, don't you, sir? Very good. You'll be tested on it in detention. You don't leave until you've got it right. So here it is. A really simple. Now, you've only got one tunable parameter there. Which is the tunable parameter? You're not doing very well here, are you? Well, of course, the tunable parameter, as everyone can see, is the complex number c. The clue is you've got two values of it on the screen there, so it must be tunable, mustn't it? Absolutely. Yeah, very good. Yeah, so you keep up. You'll get there one day. So this is the, and you've got two more or less identical values of this complex number c. All the green parts of it are identical to 12 or 13 decimal places. And what we're going to do is get this equation to draw a picture. Now, if you were doing this with the chaotic object that is the climate, you have a much more complicated equation with billions of terms in it. And any one of those terms, if you change the value just a little bit, you get a completely different picture. So what we're going to do is take a simple one to see whether we get a simple picture. After all, the values are more or less the same. Perhaps it'll be blank. Who would like to describe what we're going to see? Like to do a drawing of it? No, no, he'd rather not. Well, here it is. That simple equation gives you this magnificent drawing. Each point, each pixel there had to be calculated using 250,000 iterative calculations around that equation. So it takes quite some time to generate, because a computer can do it very quickly. And every time the color changes, that is what's called a bifurcation in the evolution of the object from there to there. And that bifurcation is rather like an extreme weather event. And the point is, even though we've hardly changed the climate at all, you still get extreme weather events. That's another reason why we know that extreme weather events are not caused by global warming, because they would happen anyway. And that's what this shows. And it also shows how very difficult it is to predict the climate. That's why another of the main reasons why the computers are getting it wrong. So on that note, I'll be very happy to take your questions. Thank you for your patience. That was quite technical, I know. You put up with it very well, but you, sir, are in trouble. Yes.
Can I ask, who does the Freedom of Information request go to regarding Aarhus?
Right, it would go to the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the first instance, because it's their job to make sure that these treaty obligations are complied with in areas that touch upon their department. If they felt it ought to go to the Foreign Office, then they would refer it on. But you certainly want to pursue that one. It means getting a little bit, do a little bit looking up, find out what Aarhus says, get the Scottish judgment, read that, do a well-informed. Fortunately, you've got a good team. here, so you'll be able to do a lot of this without too much help from me, but I will be available if you need help on this one. But that's a very good question. Start with the Department of Energy and Climate Change. The moment they get that question, they will know they're in for a fight. Yes, sir.